All right, everybody. My name is Charles Max Wood, and this is the very first episode of the podcast Playbook. And I kind of want to give a little bit of an introduction, and then I'm just going to tell my story about how I got into podcasting and what I have been through over the last 11 years. So, Podcast Playbook essentially is a show for people who have a podcast. Right, we're going to talk about some of the setup and intro stuff, but it's mostly going to be refinement on top of what you're already doing as a podcaster, right? So this isn't really a beginner podcast. It's more of an intermediate to advanced podcast. And what I'm looking to do is give you the tools and the steps that you need to follow in order to be successful as a podcaster and to grow into a professional podcaster where you're actually making a good chunk of change off of the podcasts. I personally have been self-supported off of the podcasts that I run for the last 6 years. And so I know how the game is played. I've had a few things change lately, right? And so I feel like I'm kind of getting this opportunity for a reboot and to really be able to see what the opportunities are and where things are actually going with podcasting. So let me just tell you a little bit of my origin story, and then we can kind of go from there. First of all, I got into podcasting in 2006-ish. I had a friend who bought an iPod, and it was back when the iPods were... they had the circle controls on them, right? Where you would, you'd move your finger on them to go forward or backward, and you'd hit the play button at the top or the pause button at the bottom, or hit the middle button. I think they actually had spinning hard drives in them. Right now, your phones have solid state drives in them, and so there's not spinning metal in it. But anyway, so he was listening to that, and he got way into podcasts, and he got into like Grammar Girl, he got into a bunch of other shows, right? And so we worked in the same office, and he literally sat in the desk in the corner right behind me, right? And so we were in opposite corners of this tiny office in my first job out of college, and he'd be sitting there and he'd just be cracking up, and I was like, dude, what are you laughing at? And he oh, well, I'm laughing at the show, it's so great, right? And so I realized that, it sounded like fun. And so I was like, well, I wish I could afford an iPod. And he's like, you don't need one. You can just listen on iTunes. Well, it turned out this was before iTunes was really on Windows, but I was working on the Mac beta for the company I was working for in QA. And so I was actually testing the Mac app and then giving feedback to the developers. And then anybody who was running the Mac beta would get back to me, right? And then I would give it back to them. And so I had a Mac Mini sitting on my desk, and it turned out that that was the perfect way to listen to podcasts. So I would listen to podcasts, and I would practice backing them up, because that's what we did at work. And I really got into podcasts. At the same time, I had also gotten into Ruby on Rails, which is a programming framework. And so I started listening to podcasts called Rails Envy on that Mac Mini, right? And I wasn't a professional developer. I had taken programming classes in college. I'd been out of school for like 6 months, maybe a year. And anyway, it was funny because I really enjoyed it. I listened to all these shows, got way into it. And for whatever reason, I decided that I wanted to start a podcast. And so I reached out to the podcaster I was listening to. His name's Greg. If you're in the Ruby community at all, it's Greg Pollock. And I was like, dude, I want to start a podcast. And he was like, great, you should start a podcast. And he didn't know who I was. And I thought he was some kind of like Ruby celebrity or something, right? And it turned out he was just another developer in Orlando that had gotten started with a podcast. And their podcast, they covered different news stories within the Ruby community, right? So, hey, there's this new thing. Hey, there's this new library. Hey, there's this new way of doing things, right? And I didn't want to like duplicate what they were doing, because they were doing great, and we didn't need two of those shows, or so I thought. Nowadays, if you like a show and you like the format, go ahead, right? because there's plenty of content out there, and the way you do it will be different from the way they do it, and you'll probably build an audience. So anyway, he encouraged me to do interviews. So my first episode was interviewing him. My third episode was interviewing a guy named James Edward Gray. And my 50th episode was an interview with David Heinemeier Hansen, who was the creator of Ruby on Rails. And so, I kind of built into this opportunity to interview my heroes after podcasting for roughly a year. And that was terrific. I loved doing that. It was a lot of fun. I also wound up doing screencasts at the same time. And that actually helped me get a number of jobs, right? Because people knew who I was. I had a few people that had their doubts. My third programming job, I think I had like a year and a half to 2 years of experience under my belt. Went in, did the interview. I had a friend that vouched for me, and that helped as well. But they went and checked out my content and came back and said, "You look like you know what you're doing." And they hired me. And my boss told me after he hired me that he'd had his doubts, but that I had worked out. And so it just turned into this really terrific thing. And then I got laid off from that job. And I told my wife I wanted to go freelance, and that's a completely different story. But I was freelance for about 6 months. And James Edward Gray, who I mentioned was that third podcast interview, he put up on Twitter that he'd been thinking that it'd be really great if Ruby had a panel discussion show. And I'd been thinking the same thing. We were listening to different panel podcasts. But anyway, so I reached out and I said, let's do it. Who else should we get? And so I reached out to a mutual friend of ours who was actually my neighbor at the time, named David. And then we got a couple of other guys to come on the show. And one of them ran the big Ruby newsletter. He still does. And the other one was a rather well-known Ruby developer. And so we started a panel show, and that was in 2011. It's called Ruby Rogues. Still running. More than 500 episodes at this point. And it's just, it's awesome. I love doing these shows. Well, about 6 months after we started that show, that was in May of 2011, a friend of mine who I'd gotten to know in the programming community here in Utah, he came to me and he said, "Chuck, I want to start a show like Ruby Rogues, except I want to do it on JavaScript." And I was like, "Well, that sounds like fun. Let me help you." And so I tried to help him for a while, and I don't remember the exact circumstances, but I wound up just kind of taking over the effort and starting it myself. And he was one of the panelists on that show. It's called JavaScript Jabber, which is currently our largest show on devchat.tv. And then we started a freelancing show about the same time. And then after a year or two, I was still freelance. I decided that I wanted to learn how to do iOS development, so we started that show. And then a couple of years later, some friends of mine came and they said, "Chuck, we want a show on Angular, which is a development framework." And so I told them no, because I didn't have time for another show. And they came back and they said, "Chuck, we really want to start the show." And I said, "No, I don't have time for another show." They came back a third time and they just insisted. And I was like, "All right, but you've got to help me run this, right? Because I don't know Angular." And it's funny, I'm actually wearing the shirt. I just realized that. But anyway, so we got that going. And yeah, it just got to the point where after about a year of all of that, I just didn't have time to do it all. And I had a virtual assistant who was doing a lot of the editing, and in fact, all of the editing and show notes and things like that for the shows. And it was tough. I was actually dipping into the freelancing money to pay for the podcasts. And at the same time, it was taking up so much of my time that I was having trouble getting all of my freelance work done. So I actually went to my clients and I returned their money, right? Because at that point I was making them pay upfront for work. And so I returned their money and I just told them why I was backing out, and they were totally fine with it. One or two of them were actually friends of mine who just needed some development work. So anyway, what wound up happening with all of that was that I went full-time on the podcasts. And it was interesting, too, because at that time, I had a real dilemma, because I love doing the podcasts, but I didn't think that I could actually make a living doing the podcasts. I'd been freelance for 5 or 6 years, and I just wasn't sure. I actually went to my wife, and I talked to her, and I said, "Hey, I don't, this is where I'm at." And what I wanted her to tell me was do the safe thing, right? Stick with the freelancing, it's working. And she told me to do what would make me happy. And that's what kind of kicked things over the edge. Yeah, my wife is awesome. So I went full-time podcasts, right? Returned the money, quit the contracts, and went full-time podcasting. And did that for a while. And yeah, it was just amazing. The harder I worked and the more I reached out to people, I found sponsors, and it really worked out well. And then so 2019 was kind of, it was the biggest year we'd had. We made more money in 2019 than we'd ever made on devchat.tv, which is the podcast for software developers that I run. We have 14 current running shows, and yeah, things were going great. The only up and downside, I loved doing it. It was just a little bit rough on my family. Was all the travel, right? Because I'd wind up going to conferences and speaking and meeting sponsors and, doing all of that kind of thing. And then I'd actually go and talk to sponsors and speakers of the conference and see if they wanted to be involved with the podcast, either as sponsors or guests on the shows. And anyway, in October, and this is where things come in, because this is kind of why I'm doing the reset, okay? So in October, one of my podcast co-hosts came under fire on Twitter for some comments she made, right? And I know her super well, and I didn't think that she meant them in the way that people took them. And so I stepped in and I told them that I didn't think she meant them in the way that they took them. Another friend of mine, also got involved, and he was, let's just say that he was really mean. Okay, he used some words that I wouldn't use, and it was just super aggressive with these folks. And I think what he was trying to do, in fact, he told me this, he was trying to essentially get them to focus on him and go after him instead of going after her. And I don't think that was the effect that it had. But anyway, what wound up happening was she shut off her Twitter account for a little bit. And people came to me and basically said, you need to disavow any relationship with this other guy because he was being mean. In fact, they were trying to make the case that he was being a racist and misogynist. And I know that wasn't the motivation for what he did, and so I didn't feel like that was the case. And so I didn't feel like what he had done merited cutting him off, right? I didn't like the way he did it. I kind of understand the reasons why he did it, but anyway, it's complicated. In any case, they went after him. They actually were able to impact his income. He and I were both self-employed, so anyway, so then they came after me. And I had some sponsors pull out. I had a bunch of podcast hosts actually leave. And things got really kind of tough. And things started to come back around January. So October, November, it was just, it was insane. And then October or January, things started to come back, right? And February was looking pretty good. And then COVID hit. And when COVID hit, a lot of the companies that were sponsoring my shows, the ones that had stuck around, and the majority of them had, they started really looking at their marketing budgets and thinking, we don't know if we want to sponsor in this economy because we're not sure if people are buying right now, right? And so they basically slashed their marketing budgets. And so I worked really hard March, April, May, June, July, and things, I'd find a sponsor here and a sponsor there. And anyway, it was just, it's been a tough go. And so at this point, most of my shows don't have sponsors. And I chalk most of that up to COVID-19. I think the rest of it kind of blew over, and I've seen a little bit of stuff come back, but not a lot as far as, people trying to come after me online. But that said, things are slow on the sponsorships. They're slow on the income side. And so I find myself back in that position where a lot of podcasters find themselves, where they've started a podcast and they get rolling and they have a lot of listeners, right? So our biggest show has about 15,000 listeners. Our next biggest show has about 5,000. And then the next one below that's like 4.5 thousand. So it's right up there, right? And then we've got shows that kind of vary down from there, 4,000, 3,000, 2,000, 2,500. I think our smallest shows, which are relatively new, have, 500 to 1,000 listeners, the smallest two. And so just looking at that, we are, it's like, okay, well, what do I do to pay the bills? So a lot of these folks, what they're doing is their podcasts are kind of a hobby, or maybe they have a side business and they haven't been able to connect the two. And so what do you do to get money in when you're in that position, right? And I know how to find sponsors, but I need a little bit of the economy coming back in order to help with some of that, right? And some of that's starting to happen at this point, and so I'll talk about how to find sponsors, but I also want to talk about what the other options are, right? So I'm right now working on a course. I'm working on a podcasting course, actually, but and that's why I'm kind of putting this together too, is because I want to give people the tools to run their podcast. And so I'll talk about that in a minute, the podcasting course, because it's very relevant to what we're talking about here. But I'm also going to be building a course for the developers, right? And so I'm going to be building a course about how to build momentum in your development career, and then how to maintain it over the long haul so you can get to whatever, whether it's pay that you want, the position you want, the whatever the outcome is, right? Whatever that is that you're looking for. I want to give you the tools to get there, right? And then also to build the framework, right? Because half the battle is the monetization, and a lot of people focus on that, right? So it's like affiliate sales, building a course, or writing a book, which I've done, and I'm going to be doing some stuff with my book too to promote that, right? Doing sponsorships, all kinds of stuff, right? Membership sites. I'm working on a lot of these things, right? And so I want to put that out there so that people can find it and figure it out, right? And give you not just the, hey, build a course and here's how you promote it, but actually a playbook, right? I mean, that's why I called it Podcast Playbook, is because where people really get stuck is it's not the overall strategy, like the big rock, it's the little details. How do I get that big rock in place, right? And then how do I keep it there so that it's making me money day in and day out? Or month in and month out, right? And so what I'm looking to do is to figure that out. And some of these things I've done and some of them I haven't, right? So affiliate marketing, I've done a bunch of that. I've made thousands of dollars on affiliate deals, right? I'm trying some different techniques to see if I can make them work better or different. I've never actually inserted an affiliate as a sponsor, and so I'm working on doing that as well. But yeah, so I'm working on those kinds of things. And then, how can I use affiliate to, for example, I've had some people put up the idea of putting up like a resources page, right? And so I'm going to put together a resources page, and I'll show you how to do that in the Podcast Playbook, in the course. And I'll talk about what it is and how I'm doing it and how it works in the podcast, right? And so you'll get kind of the walkthrough verbally on the podcast and, on the video on YouTube, but, the actual ins and outs of, okay, here's what I found, here's how I found people, right? That kind of a thing is going to be much more in the vein of the course, right? But it's going to be a step-by-step thing, right? So that either you can do it, or so that your virtual assistant can do it, or somebody on your team can do it, or whatever, right? I'm working on building some products, and those products are also going to be, again, it's like, hey, how do you sell your own product to, your audience, right? I'm also working on a couple of software systems for podcasters, right? Because there are podcast systems out there that are, essentially upload your media file, put in your podcast information, they'll build your RSS feed, they'll update your website, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But the way that I've run my podcast and to actually run a media network, those tools just aren't good enough. period. They just aren't, right? And then there are other systems out there that I found that seem to be good enough, but they cost thousands of dollars. And there's no reason why they should cost thousands of dollars per month, right? And so essentially at the end of the day, that's what I'm looking at. So what I'm working on building here is I'm going to give you walkthroughs, right? So on YouTube, there are going to be some walkthroughs, right? Here's how you set up your website. Here's how you do SEO on your website to grow your audience. Because that's part of the deal too, right? Is how do I grow, right? And so I'm going to show you the step-by-step, the playbook for growing. I'm going to show you the playbook for monetizing with all of these different things. I'm going to show you the playbook for just managing your content. And what's funny is a lot of these people who I'm talking to you, right? So you have your podcast and you've just kind of been seat of the pantsing it for a long time because when you started out, it was just you and that was the only way to do it. But now maybe you're at the point where it's like, this is a lot of work, or I need to hire somebody to do editing. I need to hire somebody to write my show notes. I need to hire somebody to manage my website. I need to hire somebody to do some of these other things. And so there's going to be content around some of that basic stuff, right? Here's how here's my podcast artwork, but I don't love it, so I'm going to get it redesigned, right? And I'll walk you through what I'm doing there. And so there will be that stuff, right? Here's how to build a store that sells merch, right? Shirts and stuff like that, because we've sold shirts, and so we'll walk through all that. But you're going to get the full playbook. And we'll walk you through the playbook in the podcast and on the YouTube channel. But the difference is that you're going to get it structured in the course. And you're going to get like a play-by-play write-up on the steps you have to take in order to do it. Okay? So the podcast playbook is about getting from, I've got a lot of listeners and subscribers, to monetized and a system, and that's what we're talking about here. And so we're kind of hitting those mid-level people, right? The NPRs, they do things their own way. Gimlet Media, they do things their own way. This is me, and I've got a virtual assistant and an editor right now, and I've got somebody else that helps me find sponsors, so she does the lead gen. But, how do you get there? And how do you get there to the point where it's actually sustainable from day to day, right? And things have gotten to the point where I'm actually going to have to find a full-time job. And so I'm going to be doing it on the side. And so you get to see me walk through this process of bringing this podcast network back, okay? And so I'll walk you through the process of finding sponsors. And I'll walk you through what I'm doing with affiliates and show you what's working. And I'll walk you through how I manage the website. And I'll walk you through how I manage the production process. And with all of that stuff, then you can hire an editor, and I'll walk you through the process of hiring an editor. And trust me, I just did this, and it sucked that I had to let the two editors that I had go because I couldn't afford them anymore. And I went and I actually found somebody that was considerably cheaper. But that was a process, right? And so I'll walk you through the process of hiring an editor and finding somebody that you can afford that doesn't cost you a ton of money on every episode, right? I mean, I love the work that those guys were doing, and if I could have kept doing it the way that they were doing it, I would have, but I couldn't. And so I'm going to walk you through this process of growing your podcast into the thing that you think you want, okay? And I'll probably cover some content from like Podcast Movement and Podfest. I think Podfest is doing an event this week. But anyway, that's what we're doing here, right? So my goal is to put up a piece of content every day. So if you keep an eye out for what we're doing here, then at the end of the day, every day, you should get another piece of content from me. And this is probably going to be the longest one. I'm typically going to be aiming for 10 to 15 minutes. And we'll just talk about some aspect of what's going on and what we're working on, okay? So I'm going to go ahead and wrap up. We will get in there and we'll do another part of the playbook tomorrow. And in the meantime, everybody, max out.